Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is. Have you ever noticed how silent? Can it feel like a weight? Not because it's empty, but because it's full. Full of everything we've been avoiding. An empty room. No notifications. No small talk. No one is watching. And suddenly, you're face to face with something you haven't seen in years yourself. Not the version you've been editing for others. Not the one that smiles to keep the peace or performs to feel worthy. But the one underneath all that. The one you've been running from. That's what makes loneliness unbearable. Not the absence of others, but the presence of what you've buried. And when the noise finally dies down, when the distractions fade, what's left isn't peace. At least not at first. It's restless. It's that quiet ache in your chest. It's a voice whispering, "Where have you been?" We say we fear being alone, but that's not true. What we fear is being unmasked in the silence. What we fear is finally meeting the version of us we forgot to become. And maybe that's why we run from stillness, from solitude, from ourselves. But what if that fear wasn't a threat? What if it was an invitation? Kierkegaard said, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." And maybe that's exactly what we feel when we're alone, not just sadness, but the spinning sense that we're finally untethered, unanchored, free, and yet not ready for what that freedom demands of us. See, when the world goes quiet, when the roles fall away, when no one is watching, something in us starts to tremble. We don't miss others. We miss the version of ourselves we became for them. We miss the script, the predictability. We miss the applause, the nods, the gentle validation that told us you're doing okay. But without the audience, the act falls apart. And what's left behind the mask is a stranger that looks like us, but feels distant, foreign, untouched for years. This is what Kierkegaard called despair, but not the dramatic kind, not the loud, heartbroken kind. It's quiet, almost polite, a silent tension that builds in the space between who we are and who we pretend to be. And we've all played that role, the agreeable one, the reliable one, the strong one. We become what the world rewards, and in the process, we begin to disappear. That's the tragedy Kierkegaard saw so clearly, that most people don't die of heartbreak. They fade from self-abandonment. And the most painful part, we do it to ourselves. We sacrifice pieces of truth just to belong. We betray what we feel just to keep the peace. We smile while something inside goes numb. And then, one day, we find ourselves alone, not by accident, but because we're finally too tired to keep performing. And it's here in this stillness, this ache, that something extraordinary begins. Because Kierkegaard didn't see despair as failure. He saw it as a beginning, an invitation, a wake-up call to stop hiding, Stop folding. Stop rehearsing a life that doesn't fit. Despair, in his eyes, wasn't a weakness. It was the soul knocking on the door saying, "You're not being honest. You're not home." It's not a punishment. It's a signal, a sacred one. Because only when the mask cracks can the face beneath be seen. Only when the false self collapses can the real self begin to breathe. And this isn't a comfortable path. It's not quick, but it is real. It's the slow, painful undoing of everything we thought we had to be, so we can finally become who we are. That's what makes Kierkegaard's voice so haunting and so necessary. He doesn't scream. He doesn't accuse. He just looks us in the eye and says, "Your pain is not a mistake. It's a sign you're waking up. And if you're feeling it now, that strange unease in solitude, it means something in you is ready. Ready to stop running. Ready to stop shape-shifting for the world. Ready to reclaim the voice that got buried under years of pretending. That," he says, "is the path to truth, to responsibility, to authenticity. And that authenticity, once tasted, begins to burn away everything false." It's not a light you carry. It's a fire that carries you. And once you feel it, really feel it, you can't go back. You might still be alone, but now you are no longer abandoned, because now you are with yourself. And perhaps, for the first time in your life, that's enough. And yet not everyone fears solitude. Some walk into it with calm. Some even celebrate it. Not everyone who enters solitude collapses. Some are built by it. Some don't fall apart when the world goes quiet. They rise, not in defiance, but in presence. They don't panic when no one's watching. They breathe, because they've stopped living to be seen. Where Kierkegaard shows us the pain of meeting the self, Schopenhauer stands on the other side of that meeting, silent, still, and entirely undisturbed. He doesn't offer comfort. He offers lucidity. He doesn't tell us how to escape the abyss. He shows us how to sit in it, without flinching. To Schopenhauer, solitude isn't a void to be filled. It's a space to be honored. It isn't punishment. It's privilege. Because he saw something most people never dare to see. That the person who can sit alone, without needing noise, validation, or audience, is no longer a prisoner of the world. He is free, not loud, not celebrated, but deeply, inwardly free. You see, Schopenhauer didn't fear isolation. He revered it. He believed solitude was the soil in which elevated minds grow, not in the applause of the crowd, but in the silence that most people can't bear. He saw the masses chasing stimulation, distraction, belonging, not because they were social creatures, but because they were terrified of what might surface in a moment of unfiltered stillness. He understood that many surround themselves with people not to connect, but to avoid themselves. And that's where he stood apart. Where others feared silence, he saw it as sacred. where others clung to noise. He found wisdom in the pause. To him, solitude was not empty. It was rich. It was a chamber where clarity lived, where the mind could stretch, where the soul could finally speak without interruption. But this kind of solitude isn't accessible to all. It demands something rare, a mind that no longer needs distraction to feel alive, a spirit that doesn't fear its own voice. It's not about cutting people off. It's about no longer being dependent on them to exist. The one who reaches this state no longer lives by reaction. They no longer shift and shape themselves to fit into others' stories. They've found their own rhythm, and they walk it, quietly, even if no one claps. Schopenhauer wasn't cold. He was awake. He saw the world not as cruel, but as noisy, as full of empty echoes that we mistake for meaning. And in that clarity, he chose silence, not out of weakness, but because he didn't need to prove anything anymore. In solitude, he found sovereignty, a power that doesn't seek to dominate, only to remain intact. This is the kind of solitude that doesn't demand. It simply is. And when you taste that, you stop craving presence that costs your peace. You stop begging to be understood. You stop explaining your silence. Because now, your silence speaks for itself. Schopenhauer teaches us that when solitude becomes your sanctuary, you stop seeing it as absence. You start seeing it as protection. And maybe that's the shift we all need. Not to fear being alone, but to finally become someone worth being alone with. Because when solitude no longer hurts, it begins to heal. And for those who dare to enter that space, what they find is not emptiness, but themselves unfiltered, undisturbed, and undeniably whole. Still, even Schopenhauer knew solitude can't save you if you bring a hollow self into it. There's a kind of silence that breaks you, and there's a kind that rebuilds you. Schopenhauer understood the difference deeply. In a world that never stops speaking, he chose not to raise his voice but to step back, not to be heard, but to see more clearly. He saw what most refused to admit, that constant connection doesn't always mean closeness. That being surrounded by people can feel lonelier than being alone. Because what most people call solitude is just withdrawal wrapped in fear. But the solitude Schopenhauer spoke of was something else entirely. To him, solitude wasn't a lack of company. It was a presence undiluted, undistracted. It was the moment the world stopped pressing in, and the self, finally, had space to breathe. He believed that the highest minds, the ones capable of original thought, of true perception, were not the ones chasing stimulation, but the ones who could sit in silence and stay there, not because they had to, but because they chose to, because they had built something inside a refuge no noise could enhance, and no absence could threaten. To Schopenhauer, greatness wasn't in being followed, it was in being whole, without the audience. The wise man, he said, turns inward, not out of bitterness, but because he's no longer hungry for what others can't offer. Not because he doesn't feel, but because he's learned where feeling ends and dependence begins. He doesn't isolate. He refines. He doesn't reject the world. He just no longer needs it to tell him who he is. That's the power of real solitude. It doesn't take you away from life. It returns you to a life that's actually yours. And this presence, this inward clarity, it doesn't come from retreating in fear. It comes from no longer trying to be understood by those who cannot understand themselves. It's not cold. It's calm. It's not distance. It's depth. Most people mistake solitude for suffering because they've never sat with themselves long enough to move past discomfort and into recognition. They reach for distraction the moment silence sets in a screen, a sound, a text, a fix. Not because they're social, but because they're starving for connection to the self they've lost touch with. Schopenhauer saw that. And so he taught not through noise, but through example that the mind must learn to feed itself, to generate meaning, to think, to feel, without applause. Because when you can do that, you stop being manipulated by every glance, every silence, every reaction around you. You stop living in response and begin to live in resonance. This kind of solitude, it doesn't break you. It fortifies you. It's the kind that doesn't collapse under scrutiny. It doesn't panic when abandoned. It doesn't crave to be seen. It already sees itself clearly, unflinchingly. And in that clarity is a quiet kind of power. A man who can sit with his own thoughts, who does not require echo to feel real, is not weak. He's free. That's why Schopenhauer believed solitude wasn't a last resort. It was a rite of passage. It was the transition from borrowed identity to true presence. And once you've crossed into that place, you stop explaining your silence. You stop chasing comfort. You start listening to what's been waiting to speak beneath all the noise. But even then, even in this sacred stillness, there remains a truth we must face. Because solitude, no matter how strong, cannot protect us from what we carry into it. But here's where it gets real, where all the poetry of solitude starts to sting. Because not everyone finds peace when they're alone. Many find torment. They sit in the silence and instead of relief, they feel pressure. Instead of clarity, they feel chaos. Instead of peace, they meet panic. Why? Because for solitude to nourish you, someone has to be there to receive it. And the truth is, most of us aren't home. What we call emptiness when we're alone isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of self. And that kind of absence you can't fill with friends, lovers, followers, or noise. It's a hollow built from neglect, years of looking outward for worth, and forgetting we ever had a voice inside. Psychology tells us, from the very beginning, we are taught to chase approval, smile when it's expected, perform when it pleases, win, impress, produce. We learn early that love is conditional, that identity is earned. That being seen matters more than being whole. So we build ourselves to fit the world and forget how to fit into our own skin. We perform so well. We lose the script. We adapt so much. We forget the original shape. And when all that external scaffolding falls away in solitude, in silence, in stillness, what's left? Not peace, not presence, but a haunted room, a mind echoing with everything we've avoided. We sit down to rest, and we're ambushed by the very parts of us we silenced to survive. The wounded child, the rejected emotion, the need we buried to be strong. That's what rises. And this is where most people give up. They call it loneliness. They say, "I can't be alone. It hurts." But the pain isn't solitude. It's the confrontation with all the versions of ourselves we've abandoned. It's the voice inside asking, "Why did you leave me?" And we don't have an answer, because we didn't mean to. We were busy, trying to succeed, trying to be good, trying to be enough. So we left pieces of ourselves behind one by one. A forgotten dream here, a silenced truth there, a swallowed no turned into a smile. And now, years later, we find ourselves in a quiet room and wonder why we feel so empty. It's not lack. It's not failure. It's absence. An absence of presence. An absence of self. The soul hasn't left. It's just been waiting, starving, watching you love the world more than you ever tried to love yourself. And now it whispers. It doesn't demand. It doesn't scream. It just aches, hoping you'll finally turn inward and say, "I see you." Because healing isn't about adding more. It's about remembering what you left behind. That's why solitude hurts, because it reveals what you've been too distracted to face. But here's the quiet truth. If you can sit with that emptiness, if you can hold space for the ache without rushing to fix it, you'll find something sacred beneath the pain. A memory, a truth. A piece of you that never stopped waiting. And when you reclaim it even just a little, that emptiness begins to shift. It no longer feels like a hole. It begins to feel like space. And space can be filled, not with noise, not with validation, but with you, with breath, with stillness, with truth. And in that moment, solitude becomes less of a sentence and more of a return. But even then, the mind doesn't give up so easily. It will try to pull you back into reaction, into escape, because stillness is threatening when you're used to running. But here is where everything begins to shift. Because the void, the one we've feared, the one we've tried so hard to avoid, is not the enemy. It's not punishment. It's invitation. And yes, at first, it feels like absence. like something essential is missing. But look closer, and you'll realize what's missing is you, and that aching space inside. It's not a curse, it's a door. And walking through that door doesn't require brilliance. It doesn't require perfection. It requires one thing: acceptance. But not the numb kind. Not the fake peace we create by pretending not to feel. I'm talking about conscious acceptance. The kind that sits with the pain. The kind that breathes through the discomfort without trying to fix it. The kind that whispers, "I'm not running anymore." And from that place, we begin to see. We see that we've been chasing everything: success, love, attention, purpose, not for joy, but to outrun emptiness. And now, we stop. And we turn toward it. And we ask the questions we've avoided for far too long. What am I chasing, really? Who am I when there's no one to impress? What part of me did I silence, just to be accepted? What did I give up, just to be loved? These questions cut deep. They don't flatter. They don't feel comfortable. But they free us. Because once the illusion begins to break, truth can finally enter. And truth, no matter how painful, always brings us back to ourselves. We stop filling the silence with noise. We start listening to what the silence is trying to say. We stop reacting to every shadow. We start observing the patterns. We stop asking the world to heal us, and we begin to rebuild from the inside out. This is alchemy, the quiet transformation, where loneliness begins to shift. It's no longer a signal that we are unloved. It becomes the echo of all the love we've withheld from ourselves, and from that echo, a new presence rises, a groundedness, a depth, a peace that doesn't need performance to survive. Solitude is not the absence of others. It is the presence of self. And once you touch it, really feel it, you begin to crave less. Not because you're bitter, but because you're full. You no longer chase approval like oxygen. You no longer enter relationships just to avoid silence. You no longer measure your worth in the eyes of others, because now you see yourself. You sit with yourself. You belong to yourself. And in that sacred space, solitude stops being a weight. It becomes a sanctuary, a place you go to recharge, to remember, to realign. Not a prison, a home. And here's the beauty. The more at home you become in your own presence, the more authentic every connection becomes. You no longer love to escape yourself. You love it because it overflows. You no longer fear losing people, because you've stopped losing yourself to keep them. This is the power of solitude, not isolation, but integration, where silence becomes wisdom, where space becomes healing, where emptiness becomes wholeness. And maybe, just maybe, this is what we were always seeking. Not a crowd, not a savior, just permission to come back to who we were before the world told us who to be. But even in this return, there is still one more trap to face. One last danger: we must learn to recognize the subtle, quiet compulsion to flee from ourselves again. But if there's one thing more dangerous than loneliness, it's how far we'll go to avoid feeling it. Because the most seductive enemy on this path isn't despair. It's distraction. It's how we run, even when we think we're healing. We scroll, we read, we binge, we improve, we meditate to escape, we journal to avoid, we chase enlightenment as another high. All the while, the one thing that needs our attention, the one thing we secretly fear the most, waits patiently in the quiet. Ourselves. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And the longer I live, the more I see." He wasn't exaggerating. We'll join programs, read every book, quote every wise man, and still never sit in a room alone without reaching for something: a thought, a phone, a plan, a goal. We call it productivity, we call it discipline, we call it growth, but it's often just a polished form of escape. Because silence is terrifying when you don't know who's waiting on the other side of it. And that's the real crisis. Not loneliness, not even suffering. Disconnection. Disconnection from the inner world, from our wounds, from our truth, from the parts of us that have been screaming for attention but keep getting buried under just one more thing. And the worst part, modern life rewards escape. We're celebrated for how much we can do, how much we can give, how much we can handle. But no one teaches us how to stay, how to be. So we become masters at everything except sitting with ourselves. And so, surrounded by people, surrounded by noise, surrounded by stimulation, we're still lost. Because the place we've never dared to inhabit is the very soul we've been carrying our whole life. We've become exiles in our own bodies, spectators in our own story, always performing, always managing, always escaping. And it's so subtle, we don't even notice it. We think we're moving forward when really, we're just running in circles around the one thing that would set us free if we had the courage to face it: the self. But here's the truth no one tells us. You cannot outrun your own shadow. No amount of doing, fixing, pleasing, posting, pretending can substitute for presence. Not external presence, internal. The presence that sees your shame and stays. The presence that hears your grief and doesn't flinch. The presence that no longer needs to be anyone to feel real. That's what heals. That's what roots. That's what finally brings us home. But to reach that, you have to stop. Stop performing. Stop over-explaining. Stop searching for the next thing to feel okay. You already are. You just don't remember it yet. Because the self you've been running from is not your enemy. It's the part of you that still believes in truth, in quiet, in wholeness, And it's waiting, not in the noise, not in the next chapter, but right here, in the stillness. So the question isn't, how do I escape this loneliness? It's, can I finally stop running long enough to hear what it's trying to tell me? Because that's the turning point. Not when the pain disappears, but when you choose to stay even when it hurts, even when it's messy, even when everything in you wants to reach for the nearest exit. That's where healing begins. That's where freedom starts. Not in movement, in stillness. And once you've found that, you're no longer alone. You're finally with yourself. And that changes everything. And so, the journey brings us here, to a silence no longer threatening but welcoming, to a presence no longer painful but profound. Loneliness was never the enemy. It was an invitation. The ache was the call to come home. Kierkegaard showed us the anguish of truth. Schopenhauer showed us the strength of solitude. Psychology revealed the root of our emptiness, and all of it pointed us inward, not to isolate, but to inhabit, not to escape, but to return, not to feel less, but to finally feel fully. Now, I turn the question to you. Who are you when no one is watching? Can you sustain your own company, not just endure it, but embrace it? Share with me in the comments, not a conclusion, but a reflection, a question, a moment, because even one honest voice can be a lighthouse for someone still lost in the dark. And if this stirred something in you, if it felt like coming home, then share it with someone who needs to stop running and follow the channel. Because here, we don't offer quick fixes. We offer awakening, the kind that whispers, you were never alone. You were just waiting to meet yourself.